All right, college math, here is our videos for section 1.4. And the idea of this section is, should you believe a statistical study? So whenever you're reading, statistics in the newspaper or whatnot, or newspaper, I don't know, none of you read the newspaper, sorry. Whenever you see stuff on, social media, on TV, etc., that involves statistics, should you necessarily buy into it immediately? That's kind of the idea of today, or these videos, okay? So before we go ahead and look at some guidelines for analyzing a statistical study, we're going to have to look at the steps of how to conduct one. And then before we do that, we're going to want to go ahead and talk about bias really quick. Okay. So here's a few definitions for bias. A study suffers from just bias in general if its design or conduct tends to favor certain results. So we say something is biased if it lends itself to a result without following the statistical process. And there's a lot of different ways we can see bias. And one way is selection bias, and that happens when the sample that is chosen from the population is not representative of the population. So if I have a population that's, I don't know, let's say 51% female, 49% male, then a study that suffers from selection bias would mean that the sample they took doesn't reflect that percentage in any way, shape, or form. Maybe they only surveyed, maybe the proportion of the sexes is 70% female, 30% male. Okay, so that would be one way that it suffers from selection bias. There's lots of different ways. It just comes down to the sample is not representative of the population. And then the last one is a study suffers from participation bias when individuals in the sample do not respond for different reasons. Now, you see participation bias a lot when you have voluntary surveys. So when you have, like when you pass out a survey in class and only out of the 30 students, only 20 people respond, that is participation bias. It's when people have the choice to participate in the survey, and normally they do. Like you don't want to, you're not necessarily forcing people to respond, but that's usually the case when you have surveys where people don't need to respond. We have participation bias because then if you choose the perfect sample, it's very representative. The issue is that not everybody has to respond, so then the people that actually respond don't end up um, reflecting the sample that you started with. So that's the issue there. Okay, so then now let's go ahead and take a look at, here are the steps that we need to take in order to conduct a statistical study. Okay, so there are 5 steps. And our very first step is we want to state the goal of our study precisely. We want to tell people what the whole point of our study is. What population we want to study, and then what we want to learn about them, okay? And that's crucial because the conclusions need to match the goal. If I'm studying high school students, then nowhere in my conclusions should I be talking about elementary school students, unless I have data to reference, but I should not be making any conclusions about elementary school students if my study was concerning high school students to begin with, that kind of thing. Then our next step is to make sure we choose a representative sample from the population. We kind of talked about a little bit already, using whatever method is best, whatever method would best work to find a representative sample, doing that and making sure it reflects the population. And then we collect raw data in step 3 from the sample, and we're going to summarize it using our sample statistics, those values that we calculate from the sample. Remember, in this case, statistics, we're using it as the second definition. It's referring to values that we calculate from the sample, not the study of, right? And then in our 4th step, when we get the sample statistics, once we've calculated them, we're going to use them to make inferences about our population parameters. So the values that we're interested in, the things that we want to make estimates about, we're making inferences using these sample statistics. And then our last step is to draw conclusions. What did we learn from the study based off of the data we collected and based off the values we calculated? And then do those values and data support our goal? Did we get what we were looking for? And it's okay if you didn't. You just have to make sure that you communicate that. The conclusions is one of the very key parts of the study, because that's kind of where you're saying, hey, based on all this, this is what I'm going to say is true about the population, or because of the results, I can't really say much, okay? So now we know the steps, we're gonna go ahead and kind of derive some of the guidelines we need for analyzing a study. So these are the things we need to look out for when we're reading a study and we're kind of questioning the believability and the credibility. So here's our first guideline. The very first thing, and you're going to notice that there's going to be a lot of similarities between these guidelines and the steps of the statistical study. Okay. The first thing we want to look for is the goal of the study, population, and type of study. Okay. So we want to make sure that they've completely described what their goal is, the population they're studying, and what kind of study they're using, right? And that goes back to our observational versus clinical. And that's usually where you're going to be looking for the type of study. Is the question that they're asking or is the thing that they're looking at really best answered by the study that they're using? Let's look at an example of that, okay? So here we have researchers gave 100 participants their astrological horoscopes and asked them whether the horoscopes appeared to be accurate. 85% of the participants reported that their horoscopes were accurate. The researchers concluded that horoscopes are valid most of the time, okay? So it doesn't tell us a whole lot about the population or the goal, but we can kind of make a few inferences about what kind of study they're doing here. Okay, they gave 100 participants their horoscopes and asked them whether the horoscopes appeared to be accurate. 85% of them reported that their horoscopes were accurate. Now here, what would you say this was, a observational study or a clinical study? Remember, observational is the person just observing, right? Clinical is when we're kind of comparing two different groups, whether someone is receiving a treatment or someone is not receiving a treatment or receiving a different type of treatment or placebo. In this case, what's happening is this is an observational study. Okay, so this is observational. And the reason why is because these researchers, they're not necessarily interfering because these participants wanted their horoscopes anyways. Um, what they really care about, because they're not kind of changing anything about the horoscopes, they're not giving them like a fake horoscope. They're not, that's kind of the only other option is giving them a fake one. So they're really not interfering with the treatment. They're just kind of doing it, and then they're recording what they observe from the participants. Okay, if this were a clinical study, then what would need to happen is that one group receives horoscopes, and the other group either doesn't receive horoscopes or they receive a fake horoscope. Okay, so that's kind of why we can narrow this down to observational. But then that's the issue. How can we say that horoscopes are working and are valid if we're not comparing it to a control group? Okay, that's kind of the issue here. So the flaw of this is saying a treatment. Ooh, sorry, lost my pen. Saying a treatment works without, that's my abbreviation for without, comparing to a control. Okay, if you're gonna say something works, you have to compare it to a control. I can't tell people that brushing your teeth works. Like if you were, back then when we were learning, like when we were seeing if toothpaste was a good thing for us, way back whenever toothpaste was invented. You can't say that toothpaste works if you're not, having people use toothpaste and then having people not use toothpaste and then comparing the results. Okay, that's kind of what you need to do in order to make these kinds of conclusions about treatments. In this case, the treatment is a horoscope and whether or not they're accurate. All right, so that is the main flaw here, that this was run using an observational type of study when it should have been a clinical study. Okay. So that's why it's important that when we're looking at studies, we see what type of study they're saying that it is, or the type of study that they're kind of inferring that it is, okay? Let's look at our, oh, I don't know what I did. Sorry, let me fix that. There we go. Okay. Okay, there we go. Hopefully that doesn't look terrible on your end. Okay, let's go ahead and now look at our second guideline. We want to consider the source of the study. This is one of the important ones, okay? Let's go ahead and look at the example to see what we mean by why we should consider the source. So by 1963, enough research on the health dangers of smoking had accumulated that the Surgeon General of the United States announced that smoking was bad for your health. However, a few studies conducted by the Tobacco Research Institute, which is funded by tobacco companies, found no dangers from smoking and even found health benefits. Now, you don't need to take this class in order to kind of, I'm hoping, you don't need to have taken this class in order to notice that there's something fishy about this, okay? You know, there was a lot of precedence here. There were a lot of studies that indicated that there were health dangers in smoking. So much that the Surgeon General said, hey, smoking is bad. But now we have this Tobacco Research Institute saying that smoking is good. Okay, so that is the flaw here. That is where the potential source of bias is. Okay, so tobacco, I'm gonna abbreviate this, Tobacco Research Institute. Let me erase that. So the TRI, the Tobacco Research Institute, is a stakeholder. Concerning smoking. Okay, and what we mean by stakeholder is that, well, Tobacco Research Institute, they have a direct connection to smoking. You know, tobacco, there's, you know, you can kind of see the direct connection there. The Tobacco Research Institute has no business conducting studies when it comes to smoking because, you know, they're funded by tobacco companies, so they might be swayed to make conclusions one way or another. They might be getting funding. You know, the tobacco company might be saying, hey, if you release a study saying this about smoking, then we're going to fund you for the rest of your career or whatever, right? So you always have to be careful. Now, just because someone is a stakeholder doesn't mean that it's automatically like immediately biased. It's just it causes concern, right? That's like, you know, the dairy industry saying that dairy is good for you. You know, I don't know if you guys are too young for this, but there was always those commercials that said milk is good for your bones, milk is so good for you. But now there's research indicating otherwise. And all that previous research saying that milk is good for you, who do you think was running that? Of course, the dairy companies, right? And so you always just want to watch out for this idea of stakeholders. Okay. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and end the video here, and then in part 2, we'll discuss the rest of the guidelines, okay?